Welcome to the National Environmental Policy Act, also known as NEPA introductory course, titled Aquatic and Coastal Designated Areas, provided by the Florida Department of Transportation, or FDOT's Office of Environmental Management. This training is part of a series of introductory courses that provide guidance on FDOT's process for complying with NEPA, called Project Development and Environment, or PD&E. Please see the Environmental Management Academy course catalog in the FDOT Learning Curve or the OEM website PD&E Training Track for other computer-based trainings in this series. Several of these trainings are referenced throughout the computer-based training, or CBT. A link to these sites can be found at the end of the CBT on the resources page. The purpose of this course is to provide instruction on analysis, coordination, and documentation of project impacts to Florida's aquatic and coastal designated areas. This includes outstanding Florida waters, aquatic preserves, wild and scenic rivers, and coastal barrier resources. Please note you may pause this training at any time. This course is comprised of 4 parts. Part 1 will cover aquatic preserves and outstanding Florida waters. Part 2 will discuss wild and scenic rivers. Part 3 will provide guidance on Section 4F applicability, and Part 4 will discuss coastal barrier resources. Each part is divided up further into individual lessons. Let's begin with Part 1, Aquatic Preserves and Outstanding Florida Waters. Part 1 contains 5 lessons. In Lesson 1, we will cover the basics on aquatic preserves and outstanding Florida waters. Lesson 2 will discuss the process of determining involvement with aquatic preserves and outstanding Florida waters. Lesson 3 will discuss coordination for projects that may impact aquatic preserves. Lesson 4 will cover documentation and the environmental document. And Lesson 5 will cover permitting for projects involving aquatic preserves or outstanding Florida waters. Let's begin with Lesson 1. What are aquatic preserves and outstanding Florida waters? The Aquatic Preserves and Outstanding Florida Waters process is guided by Part 2, Chapter 10 of the PD&E Manual. This chapter provides an overview of aquatic preserves and outstanding Florida waters and explains the procedure for conducting coordination to determine project impacts and how to document them in the environmental document. You may want to have this chapter handy as you go through this training. This chapter is available on DOT's Office of Environmental Management Office's website. The link can also connect you to other chapters of the PD&E manual that are referenced throughout this training. Let's start with waters designated as outstanding Florida waters. An outstanding Florida water, or OFW, is designated water body worthy of special protection because of its natural attributes. This special designation is applied to certain waters and is intended to protect existing good water quality. Section 403.06127 of Florida statutes enables the Florida Department of Environmental Protection, or FDEP, to establish a special category of water bodies to be designated as outstanding Florida waters. These outstanding Florida waters are frequently open water areas managed by the state or federal government as parks. This includes wildlife refuges, preserves, marine sanctuaries, estuarine research reserves, certain waters within state or national forests, wild and scenic rivers, aquatic preserves, and other special waters. Generally, the waters within these managed areas are OFWs because the managing agency has requested this special protection. Aquatic preserves, along with other designated water bodies, are generally considered OFWs under Rule 62-302.702F of the Florida Administrative Code. It is important to note, however, that not all OFWs are aquatic preserves. In 1975, Florida enacted the Aquatic Preserve Act. This ensured that aquatic preserves' natural condition, their aesthetic, biological, and scientific values may endure for the enjoyment of future generations. An aquatic preserve is defined in this act and in Section 258.37 Florida statute as an exceptional area of submerged lands and its associated waters set aside for being maintained essential in its natural or existing condition. Today, there are 41 aquatic preserves in Florida, encompassing approximately 2.2 million acres. All but 4 of these submerged lands of exceptional beauty are located along Florida's 8,400 miles of coastline in the shallow waters of marshes and estuaries. Many aquatic preserves are associated with public lands such as state or federal parks or refuges. Now that we know what these designations mean, let's begin with Lesson 2, where we will discuss the process of determining project involvement with aquatic preserves and OFWs. It is the responsibility of the district to determine project involvement with aquatic preserves and OFWs. The district may refer to lists along with project location maps to determine if the project may involve one or more of these designated water bodies. Areas in the state designated as aquatic preserves are listed in Chapter 258 Florida Statute. Areas designated as OFWs are listed in Rule 62-302.700 Florida Administrative Code. They are listed by county, and the list includes aquatic preserves, national seashores, and waters in national and state parks. The list of aquatic preserves and a link to the list of OFWs can be found in Part 2, Chapter 10 of the PD&E Manual. The Efficient Transportation Decision-Making, or ETDM process, is also used to determine project involvement with these designated water bodies. For projects that qualify, the ETDM process provides agencies and other stakeholders the opportunity for early input and consideration of the environment and transportation planning. This is accomplished through the use of an online environmental screening tool, or EST. Further information regarding the ETDM process and EST can be found in the ETDM manual. A link to this manual can be found on the resources page of the CBT. If a project was screened in the EST, the special designated section of the Programming Screen Summary Report may include comments from DEP's Environmental Tech Advisory Team member. Here's a sample from an actual Programming Screen Summary Report. For this project, DEP's comments identify potential impacts to a designated aquatic preserve in outstanding Florida water. They also recommend evaluation of stormwater treatment adequacy and suggest ways to reduce impacts to water quality. Other sections, such as wetlands and surface waters or water quality and quantity sections of the Programming Screen Summary Report, can also be a valuable resource. For this project, DEP commented on the wetlands section, identifying potential impacts to an aquatic preserve in outstanding Florida water. They state that the project will require an environmental resource permit and mentions that DOT will be required to eliminate or reduce the proposed wetland resource impacts to the greatest extent practicable and provide further recommendations on minimizing impacts. As you can see, these comments can be used as a starting point when preparing the PD&E study. The EST also includes Geographic Information System, referred to as GIS, data and maps that can be used to identify the proximity of the project to any aquatic preserves or OFWs. For projects that do not qualify for EST screening, the Area of Interest tool in the EST can be utilized to review aquatic preserve and outstanding Florida waters GIS data layers.
We'll now proceed to Lesson 3, which covers coordination that is required if a project may impact an aquatic preserve. Please note this coordination is only required for aquatic preserves, not for OFWs that are not designated as aquatic preserves. As was discussed in the first lesson, the district reviews information in the Programming Screen Summary Report, or GIS data layers, in the EST. Then the district uses this information to determine if the project is in, over, or adjacent to an aquatic preserve and whether there are any potential impacts. For example, if there is in-water work or issues with sovereign submerged lands, or if there are potential impacts, coordination with FDEP is required. Based on the results of this review and coordination with FDEP, the district then makes a determination of impact to aquatic preserves. To initiate coordination, once conceptual right-of-way requirements have been defined, the district should submit aerials to the Florida Coastal Office of FDEP for review and comment. Aerials should depict alternatives in right-of-way located within the boundary of an aquatic preserve. This information should be sent with a letter requesting a response in 30 days. The standard NEPA assignment statement must be included in the letter for federal projects. The mailing address for the FDEP Coastal Office is provided in Part 2, Chapter 10 of the PD&E Manual. From here, we'll proceed to Lesson 4 to discuss how impacts, or the lack of impacts, are documented in the environmental document. Projects that are not in, over, or adjacent to an aquatic preserve or an OFW are considered to have no involvement. This is documented differently depending on the type of environmental document being prepared for the project. If the project is a Type 1 categorical exclusion, or CE, or a non-major state action, no documentation is needed. For a Type 2 categorical exclusion, referred to as a Type 2 CE, the Aquatic Preserve and OFW sections of the Type 2 CE determination form should specify that the project is not present in an aquatic preserve or OFW. For a State Environmental Impact Report, or SEER, with no involvement with aquatic preserves or OFWs, mark no involvement on the SEER form in Section 2C2. Then note on the supporting information line, the project is not in an aquatic preserve or outstanding Florida water. For an environmental assessment referred to as an EA, or an environmental impact statement referred to as an EIS, simply state in the aquatic preserves and outstanding Florida waters section that the project is not in an aquatic preserve or OFW. Now let's discuss documentation for those projects that required coordination with FDEP. For Type 1 CEs, or non-major state actions located in an aquatic preserve, which will have no impact on the aquatic preserve, include coordination letters or other documentation in the project file. In cases when the project needs an Environmental Resource Permit, or ERP, address any remaining issues during permitting. For Type 2 CE, EA, EIS, or SEER project with no impacts to aquatic preserves, state in the document, this project is included in the name of aquatic preserve. After coordination with FDEP, it has been determined that the project will not have an impact on the name of aquatic preserve. Coordination should also be discussed in the environmental document. Reference coordination letters and include them in the appendix of an EA or EIS. Include any correspondence in the project file in the statewide environmental project tracker, or SWEPT. For projects with no impacts to either aquatic preserves or OFW, documentation also varies between environmental document types. For a Type 2 CE project with no impacts to aquatic preserves or OFWs, these sections of the Type 2 CE determination form are marked present and not impacted, and the name of the applicable water body is included in the summary. For a SEER project with no impacts to aquatic preserves or OFWs, mark the No column of the environmental analysis section. Now, if a project will impact an aquatic preserve or OFW, more documentation is needed. For a Type 1 CE and non-major state action, projects with impacts will be addressed at the time of project permitting. For a Type 2 CE, EA or EIS, or SEER, the aquatic preserve or OFW is identified on a map, showing the location of the project area that may impact the designated water body. For projects located in an aquatic preserve that will impact it, the aquatic preserve and OFW section of the environmental document should discuss the extent of the potential impacts to the aquatic preserve, assess the impacts that the proposed project will have on the aquatic preserve, discuss why there is no practical alternative to locating the project outside the aquatic preserve, identify all measures to minimize harm to the aquatic preserve, identify permits needed and appropriate permitting agencies, provide the results of coordination with appropriate agencies having jurisdiction over the aquatic preserve, and address any ETAC comments. For projects located in an OFW, address any ETAC comments and identify potential impacts that can be evaluated prior to permitting, including potential alternatives and treatment strategies. For a Type 2 CE project with impacts to aquatic preserves or OFWs, check present and impacted in these sections of the Type 2 CE determination form. In the summary, identify the name of the applicable water body and include details such as water quality impacts, retention, and right-of-way needs. For a SEER project with impacts to aquatic preserves or OFWs, mark the No or Enhance column of the environmental analysis section, or Yes if there is potential for substantial impact. Reference jurisdiction for the determination in the supporting information column, and remember to include correspondence in the project file. The district should also identify involvement with an aquatic preserve or OFW in the water quality impact evaluation checklist. This form can be found on the FDOT's Policy and Process Management Unit's website, and instructions for filling it out are provided in Part 2, Chapter 11 of the PD&E manual. A link to this website is found on the resources page of this CBT.
Now we will proceed to Lesson 5, where we will discuss permitting for projects involving aquatic preserves or OFWs. Projects located in OFWs receive a greater level of scrutiny by the state environmental regulatory agencies during environmental resource permitting. It is important to remember that aquatic preserves are OFWs. DEP and the water management districts generally cannot permit direct pollutant discharge to OFWs because this could lower existing water quality, thus significantly degrading them. Pursuant to Rule 62-4.242 Florida Administrative Code, no permit or water quality certification will be issued for an activity that will discharge into an OFW unless it is demonstrated that the proposed activity is clearly in the public interest and either a permit for the activity has been issued or an application for such permit was complete on the effective date of the OFW designation, or the existing ambient water quality within OFWs will not be lowered as a result of the proposed activity or discharge. Exceptions can be made for activities which occur on a temporary basis during construction for a period that cannot exceed 30 days. This is provided that lowered water quality would occur only within a restricted mixing zone approved by DEP, and water quality would not be violated outside the restricted mixing zone. The Florida Department of Environmental Protection may extend the 30-day limit if the activity or discharge is demonstrated to be unavoidable and best management practices and DEP-approved technology are employed to minimize impacts. Additional information on what constitutes assurance that the project is clearly in the public interest can be found in Section 373.414 Florida Statute, as well as 62-330-301 and 302 Florida Administrative Code. In order to document that the project is in the public interest, the district should note whether the activities will be temporary or permanent, and determine if activities will adversely affect public health, safety, or welfare, or private property. Additionally, they should evaluate whether the activities will adversely affect conservation of fish and wildlife. Some additional questions which the district should address include: will the activities adversely affect navigation, water flow, or result in harmful erosion or shoaling? Will the activities adversely affect fishing or recreational value or marine productivity? Will the activities adversely affect or enhance significant cultural resources? What are the current conditions and relative value of functions associated with the areas to be affected? In order to meet permitting requirements, there is an emphasis on minimization and avoidance of jurisdictional areas designated as OFWs. For additional permitting information, refer to Part 1, Chapter 12 of the PD&E manual. We will now move to Part 2 of this training, which covers wild and scenic rivers. Part 2 has 5 lessons. In Lesson 1, we will discuss the basics of wild and scenic rivers, study rivers, and rivers listed on the nationwide rivers inventory. Lesson 2 will cover the process for determining involvement with these rivers. Lesson 3 will discuss the required coordination and analysis for a wild and scenic river or study river. Lesson 4 will include the required coordination and analysis for rivers listed on the nationwide rivers inventory. And Lesson 5 will cover documentation of wild and scenic rivers in the environmental document. In Lesson 1, we'll discuss 3 classifications of regulated rivers: wild and scenic rivers, study rivers, and rivers listed on the nationwide rivers inventory. The Wild and Scenic Rivers process is guided by Part 2, Chapter 12 of the PD&E manual. This chapter provides an overview on wild and scenic rivers, study rivers, and rivers listed in the nationwide rivers inventory, and explains the procedures for conducting coordination to determine federal project impacts and how to document them in the environmental document. You may want to have this chapter handy as you go through this training. This chapter is available on DOT's OEM website using the link. The Wild and Scenic Rivers Act of 1968 identifies and preserves select river segments and their immediate surroundings possessing outstandingly remarkable scenic, recreational, geologic, fish and wildlife, historic, cultural, or other similar values in free-flowing condition for the enjoyment of present and future generations. Section 7 of the Act states that no federal license, permit, or other authorization be issued for a water resources project which would have a direct and adverse effect on the free-flowing condition, water quality, or the outstandingly remarkable values of a wild and scenic river, or a river under study for designation as a wild and scenic river. Water resources projects include DOT bridge projects and other roadway construction or reconstruction projects. Section 7 of the Act only applies to projects that require a federal license, permit, or authorization. Therefore, if a project is federally funded, considered a federal action, or requires a federal permit, a wild and scenic river project review is required. It does not apply to state-funded projects such as state environmental impact reports or non-major state actions. A wild and scenic river is a federally designated river within the boundaries of a component of the National Wild and Scenic Rivers system, and also includes the adjacent area. There are two designated wild and scenic rivers in Florida. The Northwest Fork of the Loxahatchee River from Riverbend Park to Jonathan Dickinson State Park, a distance of 7.6 miles, located in DOT's District 4. And the Wekiva River, which traverses 41.6 miles from the St. Johns River to Wekiva Springs, located in DOT District 5. Study rivers are rivers which are designated for study as a potential addition to the National Wild and Scenic River system. They include the adjacent area within 1/4 mile of the banks of the river. There is one study river in Florida, the St. Mary's River, which is located in FDOT's District 2. The study area includes the river from the headwaters of the North Prong at River Mile 125.8 downstream to the confluence of Bells River at River Mile 12. There are many river segments that are included on the Nationwide Rivers Inventory, or NRI, in Florida. The NRI is a list of rivers which have been determined by the National Park Service, or NPS, and other federal land managing agencies as being potentially eligible for the National Wild and Scenic Rivers system. Now we will proceed to Lesson 2, where we will discuss how to determine involvement with a wild and scenic river, study river, or a river listed on the Nationwide Rivers Inventory. The district is responsible for determining whether a federal transportation project is located within, across, or adjacent to the boundaries of a designated wild and scenic river, study river, or a river listed on the Nationwide Rivers Inventory as early as possible in the planning or project development process. This determination is often made during the ETDM process through the use of data layers in the environmental screening tool or comments from the environmental technical advisory team members during the screening. Information from the special designations and water quality and quantity sections of the programming screen summary report may include comments from the NPS or other agencies regarding potential involvement with these rivers. As seen here, DEP has identified that this project will traverse the Loxahatchee River, which is designated as a wild and scenic river. For projects that do not qualify for ETDM screening, such as some categorical exclusions, the district may use EST data layers to identify if the project is located within, across, or adjacent to the boundaries of the river segment. Mapping tools are also available on the National Wild and Scenic Rivers System and NPS Nationwide Rivers Inventory websites. A link to these websites can be found on the resources page of the CBT. If a federal project may adversely affect a river segment designated as wild and scenic, study river, or listed in the NRI, it cannot be classified as a Type 1 categorical exclusion. If a project is located within, across, or adjacent to a wild and scenic river, study river, or NRI listed river, consultation is needed with OEM to determine the appropriate class of action. A Type 2 CE, EA, or EIS may be required depending on the significance of the effects. If an EIS is necessary on projects that affect these rivers, DOT should request MPS to be a cooperating agency. Lesson 3 will cover coordination and analysis for projects involving a wild and scenic river or a study river. For federal projects involving either a designated wild and scenic river or a study river, consultation with the National Park Service and managing agencies must be conducted in accordance with Section 7 of the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act. Establishing this contact is especially important for these rivers with existing transportation systems or those with potential for expansion within the river corridor. MPS contact information can be found in Part 2, Chapter 12 of the PD&E manual. During the PD&E phase, the district conducts analysis of potential project impacts to designated wild and scenic rivers or study rivers and coordinates with the National Park Service during this analysis. River managers may also provide input for the analysis if requested and may recommend measures to eliminate adverse effects. For each alternative under consideration, the analysis should identify potential effects on the natural, cultural, and recreational values of the designated wild and scenic river or study river. If the National Park Service determines any alternatives could adversely affect the values for which a river was designated, or for closed options to designate a congressionally authorized study river, those alternatives cannot be selected without elimination of adverse effects. The National Park Service is responsible for conducting Section 7 analysis and making a determination when a federal project is proposed in the bed or banks of a designated wild and scenic river or congressionally authorized study river, or a federal project is proposed in the bed or banks of river below, above, or on a stream tributary to a designated wild and scenic river or congressionally authorized study river, and the project is likely to result in effects within a designated wild and scenic river or congressionally authorized study river. The PD&E study in itself does not substitute for a Section 7 determination by the National Park Service. Their determination is conducted in a response to the draft and final environmental document during the PD&E phase. Lesson 4 will discuss the required coordination and analysis for rivers listed on the nationwide rivers inventory. During the PD&E phase, the district conducts analysis of potential impacts the project may have on rivers on the NRI. When the project involves a river listed on the NRI and the project development process reaches the stage when potential impacts can be identified, aerials depicting alternatives, including the conceptual right-of-way limits, will be submitted to the National Park Service for review and comment. They may be submitted by mail or email. The MPS contact is the same as mentioned in the previous lesson. If a letter is sent, it should include the NEPA assignment standard statement. The National Park Service will respond to the request within 30 days. Any responses or comments received should be then resolved. This may require close coordination with MPS if there is a physical or visual intrusion of the proposed project on the river. If in consultation with MPS it is determined that the impact on any NRI river is substantial, further analysis will be needed. Instructions on the consultation process with MPS is available on the National Park Service NRI website. A link to this website can be found on the resources page of this CBT. If a response is not received from MPS within 30 days, proceed with determining if the proposed action could affect an NRI river following the National Park Service's guidance on the NRI website. Please note, it is FDOT's responsibility to ensure that effects to NRI rivers are avoided or mitigated. Now we will proceed to Lesson 5, where we will discuss how to document this analysis and coordination within the environmental document. Documentation for federal projects involving rivers that are not designated as wild and scenic study rivers or included on the NRI depends on the type of environmental document. For a Type 1 CE in the Wild and Scenic Rivers section on the Type 1 form, identify that there are no wild and scenic rivers, study rivers, or NRI rivers present, or not within a quarter mile of the listed river. For a Type 2 CE, select Not Present on the Wild and Scenic Rivers section of the Type 2 form. For an EA or EIS, include the name of the river and state that it is not designated as a Wild and Scenic River, Study River, or listed on the NRI, and clearly state that the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act does not apply to this project. Documentation for federal projects involving rivers designated as Wild and Scenic, Study Rivers, or included on the NRI which have no impacts on the river also depends on the type of environmental document. For a Type 2 CE, select Present and then Not Impacted on the Type 2 form. For the Wild and Scenic Rivers category, select Designated Wild and Scenic River, Study River, or Nationwide Rivers Inventory River and identify the name of the river. Correspondence and/or National Park Service Section 7 determination should be added as technical materials in the project file in the statewide Environmental Project Tracker or SWEPT. To document no impacts in the Wild and Scenic Rivers section of an EA or EIS, identify the classification and name of the river or segment that is designated as a Wild and Scenic River, Study River, or listed in the NRI, and discuss coordination with the National Park Service. This should include consultation on avoiding or mitigating impacts and identify that there will be no direct or adverse effects on the outstanding river values. National Park Service and managing agency correspondence or National Park Service Section 7 determinations should be included in the appendix along with appropriate information in the comments and coordination section. The final environmental document should identify measures that will be included in the preferred alternative to avoid or mitigate impacts as applicable. For projects with potential impacts to a river designated as Wild and Scenic River, Study River, or listed on the NRI, the following should be included in the summary of the Wild and Scenic Rivers section of the Type 2 Form EA or EIS. Identify the name and describe the river. Identify whether the river is designated as a Wild and Scenic River, a Study River, or listed on the NRI. Describe the surrounding environment and setting of the river. Describe the river's usage. Identify any adverse impacts on natural, cultural, or recreational values within and on each side of the river from the riverbank inland 1/4 of a mile. Examples of adverse impacts could include alteration of free-flowing nature of the river, alteration of the setting, deterioration of water quality. Address comments submitted by the National Park Service and other appropriate agencies and reference letters included in the appendix or in the project file. State alternatives and designs considered that can avoid or minimize harm. Address measures to mitigate harm. Determine if the project's impacts will preclude or downgrade the Wild and Scenic designation of the river, and adopt and summarize a monitoring and enforcement program as developed in consultation with the National Park Service and, as applicable, the managing agency, where applicable, for any mitigation listed in the environmental document. We will now move to Part 3 of this training, which covers Section 4F applicability to aquatic preserves OFWs, wild and scenic rivers, study rivers, and rivers listed on the NRI. Section 4F of the Department of Transportation Act of 1966 governs the use of publicly owned parks, recreation areas, wildlife and waterfowl refuges, and public or private historic sites for U.S. Department of Transportation or U.S. DOT projects. These resources are referred to as Section 4F protected properties. Section 4F regulations only apply to the U.S. DOT and its agencies. See Part 2, Chapter 7 and FDOT's Section 4F references website for more information on Section 4F applicability. A link to this website is found on the resources page of this CBT. Generally, aquatic preserves and OFWs are not protected by Section 4F, since the primary purpose, unless designated, is not for recreation or wildlife and waterfowl refuges. The district should determine if there are multiple-use public land holdings per 23 CFR, Section 774.11d, within these designated water bodies. Section 4F applies to only these portions which are designated by statute or identified in the official management plan for the area and determined through coordination with the official with jurisdiction as functioning or planned for park or recreational purposes, or as wildlife and waterfowl refuges, or which are significant historic sites. OEM has the sole responsibility for determining if Section 4F applies. Publicly owned waters of designated wild and scenic rivers, study rivers, or NRI rivers may be protected by Section 4F based upon their designated functions or the designated functions adjacent to and within sections of the designated river. Publicly owned lands in the immediate proximity of these rivers may also be protected by 4F, depending on the ownership and, when publicly owned, the manner in which they are administered by the federal, state, or local government managing the land. When Section 4F applies to the use of property, which is either within the river corridor or which represents an element of the outstanding remarkable values, consultation with the official with jurisdiction over the property in question, the National Park Service, and other appropriate agencies will be needed to evaluate and resolve potential alterations to the protected functions of the river and river corridor. Concurrence on the 4F finding and approval will need to fulfill the coordination and approval requirements of Sections 7 and 12 of the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act.
Part 4 of this training focuses on coastal barrier resources. Part 4 has 3 lessons. In Lesson 1, we will define coastal barrier resources. In Lesson 2, we'll cover the process for determining if coastal barrier resources provisions apply to a project. In Lesson 3, we will discuss documentation in the environmental document. We will now proceed to Lesson 1. What are coastal barrier resources? The coastal barrier resources process is guided by Part 2, Chapter 15 in the PD&E manual. This chapter provides an overview of coastal barrier resources and explains the procedure for conducting coordination and documentation. You may want to have this chapter handy as you go through this training. This chapter is available on FDOT's OEM website using this link. Coastal barrier resources are designated undeveloped coastal barriers and their associated aquatic habitat, including wetlands, marshes, estuaries, inlets, and nearshore waters. The U.S. Department of the Interior has established a coastal barrier resource system creating designated units protected by the Coastal Barrier Resources Act. Undeveloped coastal barriers are depositional geologic features which are comprised of unconsolidated sedimentary material, are subject to wave, tidal, and wind energies, and protect landward aquatic habitats from direct wave attack. They include all associated aquatic habitats, including the adjacent wetlands, marshes, estuaries, inlets, and nearshore waters, but only if such feature and associated habitats contain few man-made structures, and these structures and man's activities on such feature and within such habitats do not significantly impede geomorphic and ecological processes. Types of coastal barriers include bay barriers, which are coastal barriers that connect two headlands and enclose a pond, marsh, and other aquatic habitat. Tombolos, which are sand or gravel beaches connected to offshore islands to each other or to a mainland. And barrier spits, which are coastal barriers extending into open water attached to a mainland at one end. And barrier islands, which are coastal islands completely detached from mainland. Coastal barrier resources are protected from development and are prohibited from federal expenditures according to the Coastal Barrier Resources Act of 1982, which was later amended by the Coastal Barrier Improvement Act of 1990. The goals of these acts are to minimize loss of human life by discouraging development in high-risk areas, reduce wasteful expenditure of federal resources, and protect the natural resources associated with coastal barriers. The Coastal Barrier Resources Act is only applicable to federally funded projects. Coastal barrier resources protections do not apply to state environmental impact reports or non-major state actions. Otherwise protected areas, or OPAs, are an established category of undeveloped coastal barriers within the boundaries of lands reserved by wildlife refuges, parks, or areas for other conservation purposes. New construction within OPAs cannot receive federal flood insurance unless it conforms to the purposes for which the area is protected. No other restrictions are placed on federal expenditures in these areas. Therefore, the federal funding prohibitions of the Coastal Barrier Resources Act do not apply to those areas. Now let's begin Lesson 2, where we will discuss the process of determining if Coastal Barrier Resources provisions apply to a project. In order to determine if Coastal Barrier Resources provisions apply, review Coastal Barrier Resource System unit maps to see if the project is in the vicinity or leads directly to a designated Coastal Barrier Resources unit that is not identified as an OPA. These maps are available as a data layer in the EST. The EST can be utilized even if the project was not screened in ETDM. Maps are also available from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service website. A link to this website is found on the resources page of this CBT. If the project is in the vicinity or leads directly to one of these units, then review the federal funding provisions and exceptions to see if the project can receive federal funds. Any form of federal loan, grant, guarantee, insurance, payment, rebate, subsidy, or any form of direct or indirect federal assistance for development and designated coastal barrier units are prohibited by the Coastal Barrier Resources Act, as well as the construction or purchase of structures, facilities, or related infrastructure, roads, airports, boat landing facilities or other facilities, bridges, or causeways leading to any Coastal Barrier Resources unit, and assistance for erosion control or stabilization of any inlet, shoreline, or inshore area exception in certain emergencies. Exceptions for Coastal Barrier Resources provisions can be found in Section 6 of the Coastal Barrier Resources Act. A federal expenditure is allowable within Coastal Barrier Resource System units if it meets any of the following exceptions. Maintenance or construction of improvements to existing federal navigation channels, including the Intercoastal Waterway, and related structures such as jetties, including disposal of dredge materials related to such maintenance or construction. The maintenance, replacement, reconstruction, or repair, but not the expansion of publicly owned or publicly operated roads, structures, or facilities that are central links in a larger network or system. Construction, operation, maintenance, and rehabilitation of U.S. Coast Guard facilities and access to them. A federal expenditure is also allowable within Coastal Barrier Resource System units if it meets any of the following exceptions and is also consistent with the three purposes of the Coastal Barrier Resources Act. Projects for the study, management, protection, and enhancement of fish and wildlife resources and habitats, including acquisition of fish and wildlife habitats and related lands, stabilization projects for fish and wildlife habitats, and recreational projects. Scientific research, including aeronautical, atmospheric, space, geologic, marine, fish and wildlife, and any other research, development, and applications. Maintenance, replacement, reconstruction, or repair, but not the expansion, except for U.S. Highway 1 in the Florida Keys, of publicly owned or publicly operated roads, structures, or facilities. All highways on the federal network are essential links in a larger network or system. Non-structural projects for shoreline stabilization that are designed to mimic, enhance, or restore a natural stabilization system.
During the planning phase, projects are discussed during the statewide Acceleration Transformation Team meetings, and projects which are not eligible for federal funding under Section 5 of the Coastal Barrier Resources Act are either removed from the work program or assigned state or local funds. Projects that qualify for an exception cannot proceed with federal funding until they have undergone interagency consultation as contained in advisory guidelines. This includes U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service comment prior to federal funding approval. Consultation is only required if the project is in the vicinity of or leads directly to a Coastal Barrier Resources System unit. This coordination takes place during the PD&E phase. Note that consultation is not required for areas identified as OPAs. During the PD&E phase, the ETDM Programming Screen Summary Report is reviewed for ETAC comments in the coastal and marine issue. The screening results should identify if the project is in the vicinity or leads directly to a coastal barrier resource system unit. The district will prepare a transmittal letter to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service local field office. This letter includes the NEPA assignment standard statement. The letter should include a project description and map showing the project location in relation to the coastal barrier resource system unit. This information is sent to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service local field office and ETAP member. Contact information is provided in Part 2, Chapter 15 of the PD&E Manual. We'll now proceed to Lesson 3 to discuss the documentation in the environmental document. Documentation in Type 2 CEs, EAs, and EISs is necessary if the project is subject to the consultation requirements of the Coastal Barrier Resources Act. For projects along coastal areas where the provisions of the Act could apply, but the appropriate review has taken place and it has been determined that there is no coastal barrier resource system unit involvement, add the following or similar statement to the Coastal Barrier Resources section of the environmental document accordingly. It has been determined that this project is neither in the vicinity of nor leads directly to a designated coastal barrier resource unit pursuant to the Coastal Barrier Resources Act of 1982 and the Coastal Barrier Resource Improvement Act of 1990. For Type 2 CEs, the consultation process and final determination should be briefly summarized in the Type 2 CE form, as appropriate based on the outcome of the consultation. The correspondence and other documents developed during the consultation process should be contained in the project file in the SWEP system. For EAs and EISs, summarize the consultation and final determination in the Coastal Barrier Resources subsection of the Environmental Analysis section. Correspondence and other documents are referenced and included in the appendix. Thank you for watching this CBT. The Office of Environmental Management maintains a central library of training materials as well as documents and publications including manuals, handbooks, guidelines, and agreements. Key references pertinent to this training include the Environmental Management Academy course catalog, which is in the FDOT's Learning Curve or OEM's website. Thank you for watching.